The height of the Renaissance, far from being a time of rationality and peace, was a time of intense anxiety and warfare. As Latin Europe was rocked by reformist religious movements, the Ottoman Empire rapidly expanded and the world crept towards its 7,000th year, according to medieval calculations. A wave of apocalyptic fervor spread across the continent. The signs of the revelation of St. John were at hand, and the world would soon be destroyed to usher in the final judgment. Nowhere is this anxiety presented more spectacularly than in a single book, the Apocalypsis cum figuris. At least, so the usual story goes. Put a pin in that. The Apocalypsis was published in 1498 by Albrecht Dürer, one of the most famous artists of the Northern Renaissance. The book contains the entire text of the Revelation of St. John, accompanied by 15 massive woodcuts designed by Dürer, illustrating various scenes in the text. Published in Nuremberg in German and Latin, the Apocalypsis is one of, if not the, first artists' books. That is to say, books designed by and centering in artists' work. In the German version's colophon, where Dürer inscribes his own name, he refers to himself not as Drucker, a printer, but as Maler, an artist. The image is privileged in the Apocalypsis to an extent unseen in any other incunabula. The text struggles to fill each leaf and is completely dwarfed by the facing woodblock. Dürer's experiment with the artist's book proved to be an enormous success, and in 1511 a second edition of the Apocalypsis was published. The Apocalypsis represents Dürer's first work as an independent master artist. Born in Nuremberg in 1471, the young Dürer was heavily involved in the city's burgeoning print scene. Dürer's godfather, Anton Koberger, was the single most prominent printer in Nuremberg in this period, owning some 24 presses around the city and additional ones in 18 other cities in Europe. Koberger was basically single-handedly responsible for the city's fame as a print center and helped enable a lot of Dürer's early work. In 1483, Dürer may have already been involved in his godfather's workshop. It's been argued he was involved in the production of a gorgeous illustrated Bible, and in 1490, while apprenticed to Koberger's friend Michael Wohlgemuth, Dürer assisted in the creation of the Nuremberg Chronicle, an absolute masterpiece of early incunabula, and Koberger's most famous work. Dürer also relied heavily on Koberger in the production of the Apocalypsis. The book is printed using the same type as the Nuremberg Chronicle, so was done on Koberger's presses, and Dürer relied heavily on Koberger's networks of contacts to help distribute and sell the first edition of the book. Part of the training for any aspiring craftsperson in early modern Germany was the journeyman years, or Wanderjahre, and Dürer was no exception. From 1491 to 1494, he traveled through the Low Countries and Switzerland, honing his craft from the print and painting scenes in those countries. After that, and after a disputed trip to Italy in 1495, he returned to Nuremberg and opened up his own shop, where he produced the Apocalypsis. Dürer became famous for his prints, engravings, and portraits, earning the patronage of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I from 1511 until the emperor's death in 1519. I'll be honest, I don't have anything clever to say about Dürer. I've been a fan of his work since I was a little kid. I'm always suspicious when art historians rave about a particular artist being a genius or some such, but in this case they're kind of right. Dürer was incredibly talented in woodblocks, in metal plate etching, in drawing, and in oil painting, and he had the marketing chops to really take advantage of his skill. It's just impressive. I wouldn't call him the greatest of all printers, but he's probably the first great printer. Just look at his masterworks from late in his life. They're incredible. It is for these prints and engravings that Dürer was best known among his contemporaries. Dürer was regularly in contact with other famous intellectual voices of his age, and his friend and colleague Erasmus of Rotterdam sums up his reputation.
I have known Dürer's name for a long time as that of the first celebrity in the art of painting. Some call him the Apelles of our time, but I think that did Apelles live now, he, as an honourable man, would give the palm to Dürer. Apelles, it is true, made use of few and unobtrusive colours, while Dürer, what can he not express with one single colour, that is to say, with black lines? Is it not more worth admiration to achieve without the winning charm of colour, what Apelles only realised with its assistance?
Which takes us back to the Apocalypsis. The copy of the book stored at Harvard University's Houghton library is a really exceptional one. Unlike basically every other copy of the text, which is in black and white, this one has been skillfully and lavishly colored in. Unfortunately, we don't know when exactly this happened. The provenance of the book is completely unknown until the 1800s. However, Philip Hofer, the Harvard curator of prints and drawings who acquired the manuscript, followed E.A. Sayre, an earlier owner, in associating it directly with Durer. While it's perhaps unlikely that Durer himself did the coloration versus someone in his workshop, the mere potential opens up some intriguing possibilities. Is this a commissioned work, or was this intended as an experiment to see how color and print might better combine? Regardless of who exactly did it, the fact that this copy of the Apocalypsis is colored in is incredibly fortunate for us today. One of the most productive trends in modern book history is known as the material turn, or an increased concern with the materiality of the book. Pigments and colors are super useful for this task. Not every color is easy to produce, and some had to be transported very long distances to get from the plants or rocks that they're created from to the workshops of Renaissance Europe. So, if we can identify what pigments are in the book, we can to some extent work backwards to figure out where they came from and who made them. This is incredibly useful because so little documentation survives about 15th century trade networks. However, so much assumes that they are reliable within our primary record that any glimpses we can see is going to be really, really impactful. Unfortunately, there has not been a lot of study into what pigments Dürer is using in prints, and it's hard to tell off of sight alone. In order to identify pigments in early modern prints, usually we use either X-ray fluorescence or Raman spectroscopy. For both practical reasons and for the safety of the book, I wasn't allowed to do that. So there is going to be some guesswork here. But we're not out of luck. We do have a good sense of what Dürer's palette is for oil paintings, and we know what other artists in the 15th century are doing in prints, and between those two, we're able to make some pretty educated guesses. Also, identifying colors in prints is easier than identifying them in oil paintings. Oil paintings usually have 3 or 4 different layers of pigments in order to achieve the exact desired hue. Prints, even prints as complicated as the Apocalypsis ones here, are using at most 2 layers. So, while there is some guesswork, I think we're able to make some pretty good guesses. Just for convenience, we're also going to assume that there are no New World pigments like cochineal involved. While there are ships crossing the Atlantic in 1498, neither body of work we're using for comparison uses any New World pigments, and so for convenience, we're going to assume that's not what's going on here, and limit the map to Afro-Eurasia. Don't worry, that still is going to leave plenty of fun revelations. Before diving straight into the pigments, I also want to acknowledge the paper. Early modern paper mills tended to mark their work via watermark, an area of thinner paper in the shape of the mill's insignia. I was unfortunately unable to locate one in this copy of the Apocalypsis to get an exact location. Given that 50% or more of Dürer's costs in production were just buying the paper, I'd really like to know. But Nuremberg had multiple paper mills and was on a main thoroughfare to Augsburg, another major print town, so there are literally dozens of fairly local options here. Let's start with the color that has the least going on, black. For the most part, this color is only used for the printer's ink and doesn't actually appear in the hand-colored segments. It really is only used on a single horse. But the printed black lines and text segments are the first and most important layer of color on the blank paper, and really the only layer that we can solidly confirm was done by Dürer, so it's a good starting place. In the early modern period, printers' inks tended to be oil-based. If you are familiar with medieval manuscripts, you're likely familiar with the term iron gall ink, i.e. ink made from iron salts mixed with tannic acid from crushed oak shells. This isn't that. Iron gall ink is not sticky enough to be applied to movable type, and so by 1500 a wide array of carbon-based black inks were in use instead. Now, there is a lot of variation in this period. Johannes Gutenberg, for instance, mixed lead and copper into black ink in order to create an unusually lustrous color that can be seen throughout the Gutenberg Bible. Anton Koberger, and by extension Albrecht Dürer, used pretty standard non-metallic inks. These are, in short, made out of burnt things. It's unfortunately hard to tell whether that's soot, charcoal, charred animal bone, or something else, but for all of these carbon-based inks, if they're filtered through gum arabic and then bound with oil, it results in a very dark, very stable black, like what we see throughout the Apocalypsis. Regardless of the exact composition, this was likely produced in and around Nuremberg itself, relying on butchers, charcoal burners, farmers, oil producers, and more in the urban community to all create it. While artist manuals from the period outline numerous ways to make DIY black ink, it was also easily available in Nuremberg's apothecaries, so Dürer may have just purchased some. The next easiest color to identify in the Apocalypsis are the yellows used. Studies of other 15th century prints show that overwhelmingly the most common yellow is produced from weld, a very common weed, likely the one used for this pastel yellow seen here. There is a chance, though, that this is a pigment called giallorino, or lead tin yellow. Dürer seemed to prefer giallorino as a fairly stable yellow for portraiture, but it's generally rarer in colored prints than weld is, so I think it can go either way. The darker yellow is a somewhat different story. This isn't a case of just applying a second coat, this is an entirely different mixture. And while weld lakes could be mixed to various hues, given how dark this one is, I think it's more likely a different material entirely. Now, given how translucent it is, I actually do think it's another organic pigment, and what that means is that this is either saffron or buckthorn. Now, these are exciting colors. Saffron is grown all over Europe and the Mediterranean in this period. That means it could have been imported from England, France, Venice, Greece, or the Ottoman Empire into Nuremberg, the continent's most important trade hub for the spice. Saffron is incredibly expensive, however. One estimate puts the price in 1500 at 864 German pfennigs per pound, or doing some guesstimation, about $300 a pound in today's money. That's a lot, and so I think it's more likely that buckthorn is what's being used instead. Yellow buckthorn pigment is obtained by grinding unripe buckthorn shells. If they ripen, the resulting pigment turns green. However, in this period, buckthorn did not grow in Europe. In 1500, buckthorn had to be imported from the Ottoman Empire, giving it the name Persian berries. An apothecary in Nuremberg would probably have gotten them from Venice, transported from Ottoman ports on the Anatolian coastline. The raw shells for grinding could then be easily and cheaply resold around the European markets. Price lists from Nuremberg in this period suggest that buckthorn was not expensive, which means that the trade was likely occurring in high volume in this period. The next easiest pigment to identify in the Apocalypsis are the greens. There are quite a few different shades of green in these illustrations. 2 different shades in the clothing, a different one for the grass, and a stylish teal on one guy's hood. There's also a lot of ways to produce a green. The Il Libro dell'Arte, a painting manual composed around 1400 by Florentine artist Cennino de Andrea Cennini, describes no fewer than 7 different ways of producing green paints. However, we're in some luck here. To identify these pigments, all we have to do is look at the backside of the page. We can see here brownish splotches. These all correspond to the greens, and blues, but we'll get to that in a little while, in the coloration. What this means is that the pigments used are causing the underlying paper to corrode. This is a bit of a conservation nightmare, but it allows us to somewhat confidently say that these are all produced dominantly with a pigment known as verdigris.
There is a green pigment called verdigris. It is sufficiently green of itself and is an artificial chemical production made of copper and vinegar. Be careful never to put it near white lead because these two colors are mortal enemies in everything. Grind it in vinegar and it makes a green for grass most perfect and beautiful to the eye, but not durable. It is good on parchment, on paper, or on vellum, tempered with the yolk of an egg.
Now, I say dominantly pretty carefully here. It's extremely likely that in order to achieve the hues we see in the final prints, that the verdigris is being mixed with various other pigments, like azurite, orpiment, or saffron. It might be possible to figure out which one is being used where using Raman or XRF spectroscopy, but again, I'm a YouTuber, not a chemist. So let's just leave it at verdigris mixed with various other stuff. Because verdigris is a pigment created by chemical reaction, rather than a mined mineral, it's basically sourced wherever copper is found. There were huge copper mines in Swabia and Tyrol that are the likely source for this copper and a pigment we'll see later, so the transmission chain from there to Nuremberg is fairly short. There's a lot of reds and oranges in the Apocalypsis. The text is rubricated in scarlet initials and marked up in orange. Clothes, colored in purple and orange, leap off the page, and people's skin retains a pinkish hue. Despite the wide array, these are largely based on only 3 pigments: vermilion, red lead, and brazilwood. Vermilion, also known as cinnabar, is an artificial pigment made of mercury sulfide. It is one of the purest reds available, making it very popular in the Renaissance. It's the source of some of the brightest reds in the Apocalypsis as well, especially in the rubrication. While the lettering is done in ink, not paint, it is this wonderfully vibrant color. What gives it away as vermilion is how unique it is. When we zoom in really far, we can see that the red initial and the orange underlining are clearly not the same ink, suggesting that the purer red is cinnabar. There aren't a lot of places in the hand-colored woodcuts that obviously use vermilion, but it may be used to enhance skin tones or to create colors like the pink that we see here on this angel's clothing. Red lead, in contrast, appears all over the Apocalypsis. The skin tones are likely caused by the very gentle application of red lead to the figure, something known from other woodblock prints, while clothes are just drenched in it. When applied heavily, red lead has this really distinctively opaque orangish color, and so when we compare the Apocalypsis prints to other prints where the red lead has been chemically confirmed, they do look really similar. Now, to be fair, there are other oranges possible. Railgar, for instance, is a pigment known from the period. The problem is, it's made from arsenic and sulfur, and so it's incredibly toxic to the point that multiple painting manuals from the period recommend not using it. Off of that alone, I think we can be pretty confident in our identification of red lead, but we actually have a way to be even more certain.
Be careful never to put it near white lead because these two colors are mortal enemies in everything.
What Giannini is talking about there is a reaction between white lead and verdigris that turns the affected area black. Now, red lead and white lead are extremely chemically similar, and so it turns out that they both actually have the same reaction with verdigris. Red lead's is just a little bit less intense. There is one spot where this exact reaction shows up. On the very first woodcut depicting the martyrdom of St. John, there is one spot where green and orange do overlap. Instead of the vibrant green that we would perhaps expect from two complementary colors, the lapel of this robe has turned a stale brown. This suggests that yes, the orange we see is red lead. The rich red-purple color that we see on angelic robes is the final unique red pigment used in the Apocalypsis. There's a few different organic materials that can create this pigment, most locally to Nuremberg, madder root. However, madder is not used in any other contemporary prints, so it's probably not that. Instead, what we're looking at is a pigment derived from brazilwood. Brazilwood, a pigment derived from the tree Cheselpinia sapon, is a very popular pigment to use on paper in this period. Brazilwood was cultivated in South America in the 16th century, and actually is the source of the name of the country of Brazil. But prior to that, it was actually only grown along the Indian and Southeast Asian coastlines. The wood was largely processed by skilled women who boiled the wood to extract the color. The extract was then dried, packaged, and shipped across the world. It creates a beautiful purplish dye, seen here in a print from the Morgan Library. It's very common in 15th century German prints, much more so than any other organic red, so we can safely identify the Apocalypsis purple as being Brazilwood. Turning to our map, Brazilwood makes us zoom out a little bit. Brazilwood was harvested and processed in Indonesia and India. Then, utilizing Indian Ocean trade routes, it traveled to the Ottoman Empire or via Portuguese colonies all the way around Africa. From there, it either hopped overland to the Mediterranean ports, or was carted by boat and caravan to the major print hubs of Italy and Central Europe. While we don't have data on how much was actually imported, its popularity and relatively low price suggests that a truly staggering amount was crossing the continent to the European markets. Before we wrap up, there's a couple of colors I want to acknowledge that I don't have time to talk about in detail. Several beards and wooden things are painted brown, and there's almost certainly some white lead, chalk, and gypsum involved in creating the specific lighter hues that we see throughout the book. These are all things that can be locally sourced from Nuremberg just by digging clay out of the ground, so they aren't super exciting for our purposes, but they are important because they're indicative of the level of artistry that's going on in the book. Early modern watercolors generally have a style of being a bit less precise than earlier medieval miniatures, but the Apocalypsis and its colorists really show a high degree of skill in knowing how to produce very specific hues out of each basic color. A big part of that is using quote-unquote boring colors in order to make the big, bright, exotic ones shine even brighter. Blue is an unusual color to find in early modern prints. Basically, every scholarly analysis agrees that it's not part of the standard palette for German prints because blues are very expensive. Even the cheapest blue available in Nuremberg's markets was over twice as expensive as most yellow pigments, and if an artist wanted to use actually nice materials, the price jumped to over 8 times the price of a yellow. And yet it is all over the Apocalypsis. Most obviously, it occurs on the cloak of St. John of Patmos and associated saints, but it also appears on a lot of other things. It's used as shading on the clouds in basically every print, and it seems at least a few times that blue painted over a layer of earth brown is used to represent black.
When he opened the 6th seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth, the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale.
Like the green verdigris we discussed earlier, the blues in the Apocalypsis are basically universally causing degradation on the underlying paper. That strongly suggests that we're looking at a copper-based pigment throughout, and that's a pigment known as azurite. Azurite is a mineral of oxidized copper, often found on the edges of ore veins. It's a really vibrant blue color, and when the crystals were ground and sifted, a wide array of hues could be achieved in the period. In the context of the Apocalypsis, it looks like the clouds may be colored with a more finely ground, and therefore lighter azurite, while the clothes and roofs are a really opaque, coarse pigment. Around 1500, azurite was mined in Tyrol, Swabia, and Slovakia, leaving many trade routes to get to Nuremberg. It's also the most commonly used blue in Dürer's oil paintings, which is a strong mark in its favor of being the blue we see here. It is surprising to me, though, how much some of the azurite has degraded. The clouds have almost turned completely brown in many places on the page, and whatever color this horse was originally supposed to be, I can't say it's very pleasant to look at anymore. This is super striking, especially when compared to how well preserved some of the blues are in clothing and roofs. There's still some degradation, especially when compared to the blue ink in the rubrication, but it really hasn't been consistent across these prints. What that suggests to me is that there's a chance that there is a second blue pigment involved, ultramarine.
Ultramarine blue is a color noble, beautiful, and perfect beyond all other colors, and there is nothing that could be said of it but it will still exceed this praise. With this color, together with gold, let everything be resplendent, whether on walls or panels.
Giannini continues like that for pages about how great ultramarine is, and Dürer agreed. He traded for some while in Antwerp in 1492 or 1493, and his letters consistently praised the pigment. Ultramarine was prohibitively expensive though, so he didn't actually use it very often. Ultramarine is so expensive primarily because of where it's from. The lapis lazuli that's used to create ultramarine pigment is only found in what is now Afghanistan, at the time the eastern border of the Safavid Empire. The trade route was really rough, being both remote and consistently plagued by bandits. To get to Antwerp, it probably had to get shipped across the Safavid and Ottoman empires, then shipped from Baghdad around Africa directly to the Low Countries. As an alternative route to Nuremberg, it would have been an overland haul all the way to the Mediterranean coast, and then probably sold in Constantinople to Venetian merchants. It's one of the most difficult trade routes in Eurasia, so even though brazilwood and Asian spices traveled farther, supply wound up really limited and the price exceptionally high. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to check for the presence of ultramarine in the Apocalypsis using either ultraviolet or infrared fluorescence. I asked the reference librarian if I could, they asked the curator asked the conservators, and the conservators quite vehemently said no. So that's off the table. That being said, if I'm honest, it's actually pretty unlikely. It seems like hand-colored prints just don't have the same prestige that oil painting does in this period, and ultramarine is so ridiculously expensive, it seems like it pretty much only gets used for big prestige projects. It's also, just not that common in the Holy Roman Empire. In this period, there's only 2 people that have access to it, Durer and then one other guy. So it's not super likely that it's being used here. That being said, it actually would be congruous with medieval religious hierarchies. Ultramarine tends to get saved for illustrating very important scenes in medieval miniatures, and the robes of St. John the Evangelist definitely count as important. So, while it's unlikely, it is plausible enough that I decided to include it in this video. Looking at this map, I honestly couldn't be happier. What stands out to me, from a materials perspective, is how simultaneously local and global it is. A lot of the earthen pigments or artificial pigments could be produced in and around Nuremberg, which probably helps keep the cost down in a time when no pigment production could be mechanized. However, at the same time, there's a clear reliance on trade networks that in some cases span thousands of miles to really bring these colors and these prints to life. It's honestly really moving to me to imagine the men and women who worked as harvesters, processors, sailors, merchants, coal porters, resellers, and printers around the world who all in some small way helped contribute to this book. Contrary to what Philip Hofer argued, this is actually very much the standard palette for 15th century German prints. The colors that can be found in the apothecaries of Nuremberg are, at least visually, the best matches to what we can see in the Apocalypsis. What's surprising is the quantity and the quality of these colors. Whoever did this work was an extremely talented artist and brings a level of subtlety to the coloration that, while maybe it doesn't improve on the black and white versions of these prints, definitely leaves the color versions on par to them. Now, was that person Dürer? Unfortunately, I still can't say. Without doing more complex analysis, there's really no way to confirm that the pigments in this copy of the Apocalypsis are the same as what Dürer preferred. The presence of ultramarine in particular would be really suggestive. There's not very many people in this period who have access to that pigment, especially not in the Holy Roman Empire. There's also nothing in the provenance of this particular book that I was able to find that would really suggest more strongly that Dürer was involved. However, what we can say is that this book represents something that Dürer might have approved of. See, the Apocalypsis was printed with empty spaces in the text block for a hand-done rubrication. The small letters in those little squares represent what letter is supposed to be painted there. Most copies weren't ever rubricated, though. They just left it blank. So this copy, having done that work, suggests that this is well within Dürer's intentions, and maybe supports the idea that these more elaborate illustrations were something that Dürer himself would have approved of. And it pays off. Ending up on par or improving on a Dürer print is no mean feat. And so looking at these colored versions of these prints, I really do think that the person who did that coloring work might be among the greats of the Renaissance art scene. Dürer became an international sensation thanks to the Apocalypsis. Viewers across Europe purchased the book, which sold out rapidly. Some of those viewers may not have even believed that there would be a world left for very long to enjoy Dürer's art. At least, so the usual story goes. Put a pin in that. Let's pull that pin out now. The coloration of this copy of the Apocalypsis really complicates the apocalyptic millenarianism of the broader Renaissance. Now, Dürer himself doesn't appear to have been a millenarian. In 1498, he's publishing and printing on a wide variety of subjects, not just the Apocalypsis, and an artist's book might be the single most expensive way to try and sell prints. Some of his viewers almost certainly were, however. It's not hard to imagine someone in the style of Erasmus of Rotterdam or Martin Luther looking at this copy of the Apocalypsis, being enamored by the colors in it, and not realizing where the colors come from. Now that's a super interesting conundrum, because a lot of the major pigments we see in this book either were sourced from or had to travel through the Ottoman Empire. And yet, millenarian belief, potentially exacerbated by this book, is more than a little bit Islamophobic. St. John was historically murdered by the Emperor Domitian. When we look at how he's portrayed in the Apocalypsis woodcuts, however, Domitian looks suspiciously like an Ottoman sultan. The people worshipping the dragon with 7 heads are also clearly wearing Ottoman turbans. Other engravings show that Dürer had a more complex relationship with depictions of Muslims than just straightforward Islamophobia, but if nothing else, these prints demonstrate how closely millenarian belief, religious conflict, and artistic production were intertwined. Trade networks in the 15th century were a little bit more visible than they are in the 21st, but they still weren't that visible. Thanks to merchant guilds with contacts all around the hemisphere, materials could be shipped to just about any city in Europe fairly quickly. Cennino Cennini or Albrecht Dürer can go down to their local apothecary and get powdered pigments with only marginally more difficulty than we can go down to the craft store and get paints today. This has the effect of rendering the human labor that those networks rely on invisible. It's only when things start failing, like with the absence of ultramarine, that the human labor once again reappears in our consciousness. And yet, we forget that at our peril. Even as the most learned people in Europe were seeing the signs of the end of the world everywhere, and were processing that into art, they were reliant on pigments that were being produced by people who did not care, right? Across religious boundaries and across political boundaries, there were people constantly working to make available the materials that these intelligentsia were using to talk about the end of the world. And so, right, the end of the world couldn't have happened in the way they were imagining, with the religious fervor that they were imagining, because it's all reliant on a network far larger than any single person could comprehend to make it all happen and to make their creative outputs possible. In our historical record, there's only a few glimpses of how extensive medieval trade networks could be. Yet, the creation and distribution of books like one colored copy of Dürer's Apocalypsis cum figuris give us clues into how many people, whose names have generally been lost to time, were involved in making this happen. From German charcoal burners to Indonesian lumberjacks to Ottoman laborers, people all over the world participated in the creation of this book. As Dürer skyrocketed to fame through this volume, carted around Bavaria by a man named Jörg Kohler, as well as sold in Anton Koberger's many shops, his work would start moving out back along the same trade networks that brought the pigments he used into Nuremberg. In so doing, the networks and people involved with them become an embodied part of this book's history, joining the blessed martyrs in the heaven of the bookish canon.